Hello everyone. Today we're gonna talk about the fold-out label and what the new CLP revision requires, what the requirements are for the fold-out label, and also when to use a fold-out label. So let's go into that first. So before the CLP revision was publicized, the CLP regulation allows the use of fold-out labels only if the general rules for the application of labels cannot be met due to the shape or form of the packaging or due to the small size. So that means if you want to have additional languages and because of those additional languages you want to use a fold-out label, that was not allowed. So, for example, if I would put the product in Europe on the market and I want to use a fold-out label and I'm going to put it on the market in the Netherlands, then for the Netherlands, you cannot even use a fold-out label, most likely, because the minimal requirement for the Netherlands is only the Dutch language. And so you need to just use the normal physical label. For Belgium, it's a different amount of languages necessary. That's Dutch, French, and German. For those countries, it is more likely that a fold-out label is used to meet those minimal requirements for the label of for a CLP product. Well, with the new CLP revision, they give companies more flexibility. Suppliers can use a fold-out label on a regular basis. There are no restriction on when to use a fold-out label anymore. However, if you choose to use a fold-out label, there are specific requirements for the content of the front, the inner, and the back pages. So let's look at the requirements of the fold-out label. What you need to realize is that there are new requirements for the physical label that is also applicable for the fold-out label. And we have given a webinar about that last month. So I would recommend to follow that webinar to know what these new requirements are. And the deadline for this is 1 July 2026. So let's look at the additional requirements if you're going to use a fold-out label. And it's the requirements are mentioned for 3 different parts of the fold-out label: the front page, the inner pages, and the back page. So let's look at the front page. Here's an example. They mentioned that we need to have the name, the address, and the phone number of the supplier on the front page. You also need to mention the nominal quantity of the product, unless if you're gonna mention this somewhere else on the package. Then you don't have to mention it on the front page of your fold-out label. Also, you need to have a reference to the inside of the fold-out label. You can write it down in text, but if you're gonna have it mentioned in text, then you need to make sure that you have all the translations on the front page. So it's better to use a symbol, because that's also allowed, that can be used universally, that informs the user that the label can be opened. Also, you need to have the abbreviation of each language mentioned that you're gonna mention in the pages of your fold-out label. That can be in the form of a country code or the language code. There's also a couple of product identifiers that is mandatory to mention on the front page. If your product consists out of 100% substance, then the name of that substance needs to be mentioned on, and additionally the identification number. For example, the CAS number. If your product is a mixture, then the minimal requirement is to mention the trade name on the front page. Please be aware in this case, you need to have all the translations mentioned of these product identifiers on the front page. So if your mixture has separate trade names for each country, so all different translations, then you need to mention all of these trade names. So we would recommend to use one trade name that is applicable for all countries, so you don't have the problem of of the space that you have for your front page. For substance is a little bit more complicated, because if there is a legal classifications for the substance, that means that there are official translations for that name of the substance, and all of those translations needs to be mentioned on the front page. Also, depending on the classification of your product, then you need to mention the hazard pictograms that is applicable, the signal word, and that needs to be translated in all languages that are also mentioned in the inside pages, and the UVI code. For the UVI, you can also choose to not mention it on the fold-out label, but then it needs to be located on the inner packaging, so in this case directly on the bottle, and it needs to be located with the other label elements. So you cannot put the UVI code on the other side of this bottle, because then the label elements are not together anymore. So those were the requirements for the front page. So let's look at the inner pages. For the inner pages, all the elements that are provided in Article 17.1 needs to be mentioned in the inner pages, except for the hazard pictogram and the supplier identification. So here we see an example. So on the right side, you have the front page, and if I fold it out, I will get these three different languages: English, Spanish, and Polish. And they are grouped together by language. So that is a requirement for the fold-out label. You cannot put, for example, the signal word with all the translations in a row. No, you need to put it per language, so the user that's going to read everything in one language can easily find all the information. So what are these label elements exactly? So here again, for if your product is 100% substance, it's the name and the identification number. But for a mixture, it is the trade name and the identity of all substances in the mixture that contribute to the classification. And that's normally up to 4 substances if they reflect all the hazards of the product. Otherwise, it can be more. And depending on the classification of the product, where applicable, again, the signal word needs to be mentioned, but also the hazard statements, the precautionary statements, so that's the H and the P statements, and the supplemental information. So for example, the EUH 208. Part of the supplemental information is also the label elements that resulting resulting from the requirements set out in other union acts. That means, for example, label requirements from the detergent regulation, the biocide regulation, and the fertilizer regulation. And it would be good to have guidance in the future publicized, so we know how this would look like, because it's quite difficult to imagine how these inner pages would look like in the fold-out label. And lastly, we have the back page, and it's actually the same as the front page, except for the abbreviation of the languages that are used in the inside pages. That are, they don't have to be mentioned on the back page, of course. And also the symbol that that refers to the inside pages, that's also not necessary anymore on the back page. And the back page is firmly affixed directly to the bottle in this case. Lastly, what I want to also point out is that the example that we are used is not the only type of fold-out label that exists. There are other types of fold-out labels, and it would be good to have a CLP guidance that would also show these different examples, because sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish what exactly is the front page, the inner pages, and what is the back page. We have an idea about it, so if you would like to have advice on this, you can always contact us by email or call us, and we can give advice on this part of CLP regulation. The next webinar that we're going to have is going to be on small packaging, smaller than 125 ml and smaller than 10 ml. If there are any questions that you have, you can always contact us, as I said previously, by phone or by email. Thank you for listening, and hopefully see you at the next webinar.